Today's episode is presented as part of the Wignall Museum's Home Edition, a series of curated artist talks, workshops, and discussions featuring artists and cultural workers. My name is Rebecca Trawick. I want to thank you for joining us today. The Wignall Museum is a teaching museum and interdisciplinary art space that introduces Chaffey College students, faculty, staff, and community members to innovative contemporary art objects and ideas. By fostering critical thinking, visual literacy, discourse, and empathy, the museum seeks to enhance the intellectual and cultural life of our community. We want to take a moment to recognize that we're situated on the Rancho Cucamonga campus of Chaffey College, which resides on the traditional and unceded lands of the Tongva people. We offer our respect to the elders, both past, present, and future.
Hello, my name is Roman Stollenwerk. I'm the assistant curator at the Wignall Museum of Contemporary Art. Please visit us at our website at www.chaffey.edu/Wignall to access recordings. We will send out and post announcements to our email subscribers and social media when the videos are available on our site. Thank you.
And hi everyone, my name is Andy Hadel. I'm the preparator at the museum and studio tech for the Studio Arts Department at Chaffey College. Along with Rebecca and Roman, I'll be assisting with today's Zoom session. Here's a brief breakdown of today's program. In a moment, we'll hear from Cindy Rheem and Amanda Maciel Antunes as they present for about a half an hour, with the remaining time available for question and answers.
Thanks, Roman and Andy. As mentioned, today we have the honor of having two prolific feminist artists in conversation, Cindy Rheem and Amanda Maciel Antunes. We invited Cindy to choose an artist that she finds compelling to speak with as part of Home Edition. She chose Amanda, and we're delighted to spend time listening to these two in conversation today. Before they begin, I'll share truncated versions of their biographies with you, and you can find their full biographies in the program guide found on our website. Cindy Rheem is a Los Angeles-based artist and arts educator. She serves as co-facilitator of the Sikzu Reading Group and is co-founder of the feminist-centered projects Craftswoman House and Feminist Love Letters. Rheem's interdisciplinary practice moves between drawing, performance, and video to address the cultural suppression of women's narratives and the legacy of hysteria. Rheem's work has been shown at venues throughout the US and at galleries and museums in Italy, Bulgaria, and France. Amanda Maciel Antunes was born in Brazil and currently lives and works in Los Angeles. She is self-taught and began making art as a child with her grandfather, who was a self-taught painter, writer, and sculptor. Antunes uses painting, writing, film, assemblage, sound, and performance to present conversations between the polarities of selfhoods, such as life and death, light and shadow, seen and unseen, known and unknown. She creates for and in non-traditional spaces and focuses on responsive performances in dialogue with both the history of the site and the immediate landscape, incorporating a broad range of media and often engaging all the senses. Antunes' work has been included in exhibitions in Los Angeles, Iceland, and Brazil. Non-traditional sites of note where durational performances have been staged include a former World War II military shelter in East LA, a historic theater in a northern fjord in Iceland, the Crowley Theater in Marfa, Texas, a former dairy farmer's cottage in the high desert of California, among others, and most recently at the Mount Wilson Trail in the Los Angeles National Forest. Please welcome Cindy Rheem and Amanda Maciel Antunes.
So before I explain what it's the current practice that I'm doing in the National Forest, I wanted to introduce you a little bit to my background in durational performance. I've started performing in Boston when I first moved to the States. By accident, I was invited by a friend of mine, Autumn An, another performance artist, to become her avatar in a gallery, as her body couldn't be there at the time. She was stuck somewhere else in another country. So I performed in her place, and it felt very much like everything I've wanted to create in the space and time, and it felt very natural. So since that day, I began a practice that I call it a memory practice or oniric practice of performance. And I'll explain a little bit of what that means. But I reflect in some ways through performance in the selective nature of memory and cultural inheritance. By that, I mean what language means to the body and how language perceives and interprets our present. I combine in my performances an idea of space in collaboration with fragmentation that I find in the landscape. Every performance I've done that's durational have been in various areas of the remote locations, including the National Forest in the middle of fjord in Iceland, where I've developed a relationship with the community. And through the community, I've received gifts, material, and forms that I've used in performance in that location. And I'll be showing you briefly some of the images from these pieces. This first one is called Memory House. Memory House has been happening for 3 years, and I've had 6 different iterations of the piece. Every iteration is in a different location. This one in particular was last year in Joshua Tree in an abandoned cottage that had been blown by the winds in a national storm. Memory House took this one Epilogue, called Epilogue, was the beginning of the series, although it was the last performance of the series. So the narrative here is very much non-linear, which is how I also work with my practice. Epilogue, when I moved into this house for a weekend, I performed from sunrise to sunset, nonstop, and for 2 days. The idea of working with light through these walls that were falling apart were very much a part of the process. And I had as a guiding mechanism the change of wardrobe, black and white. So black, I became familiar with the nighttime, and white, I became familiar with the light during the day. This one happened in Iceland. I found this airplane, I think a site for airplanes to land in an island, and it had this structure. I used stick notes every day, every time I walked by it, to remind myself of what happened the day before. And that's what you see. And the stick notes guided me through movement and performance in a repetitive, cyclical manner through the time that I lived in this island. This one was inside the World War II shelter, where I translated one single poem to 45 languages, and I translated it back into the original, which was Portuguese. In order to understand a series of conversations with myself in adaptation as an immigrant, I translated this poem myself. It's a poem that speaks to our idea of interpretation and our idea of what does it mean to be a poet, meaning an artist in the world that repeats itself through history. In this poem, I noticed that every single translation in other languages interpreted the word fingidor differently. So people translated into the magician, the illusionist, the faker, the illusory, the faker. To me, in particular in English, the translation had a very heavy connotation. So I kind of took that translation to illusionist, which felt a little bit more like the original interpretation. And then it led me to a performance I had in the desert of California. For 24 hours, I walked wearing a parachute in 4 different deserts. A friend of mine, Eric Rehm, performed a drone and followed me with a drone lens. And this is another iteration of Before Language inside Shoebox Projects, downtown LA. I performed for 3 weeks, 24 hours a day for 3 weeks, from sunrise to sunset. This is the interior of the space where I've used for those 3 weeks. Part of the performance imagery that I collect, I call them artifacts. In some ways, the performances that I've done don't require an audience. And if you don't have an audience, what is it there to show? Is there anything you should share afterwards? Is it just ephemeral? Does it just live and dies there? I've always questioned myself that, and I don't know exactly what it means to document a performance. I create objects and I create artifacts made from these moments in time that eventually become the memory of this time in my life, or of these 24 hours. So these are examples of memory compositions that I take with between travels between my home place and my current place of home. And you can see them, they're stitched together in parallels. I'm creating this parallel life of memories in dissolution. This is another iteration of Memory House. The images on the right are stills from the video and the film that I pre-recorded to play inside the pink house. I built the pink house with scraps from a dumpster, scraps of wood from a dumpster in downtown LA. And I covered it with dyed muslin. Leads me to this piece, which will introduce the idea of the National Forest, what happened here. But this quote from Margaret Wood describes in many ways what I'm trying to recreate within performance. It's impossible to say a thing exactly the way it was, because what you say can never be exact. You always have to leave something out. There are too many parts, sides, cross currents, nuances, too many gestures, which could mean this or that, too many shapes, which can never be fully described, too many flavors in the air or on the tongue, have colors, too many. The interior of Memory House was recomposed with fragments of the outside landscape, which was parts of broken glass, and parts of the wall itself became the interior of the house. So in some ways, I'm also trying to reconstitute and reiterate the piece itself by creating my own memories in the space. Its endurance, and it takes so long, and some people ask me, why do you have to perform for 24 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks, 200 days? I don't know exactly how long I'm performing for. I allow the space to practically guide me into the time and space that I'm there. I give myself enough time to create a memory in the space, because that first memory will guide me into the present moment of moving my body or of making something. And the time itself gives me enough memories to work from the cyclical movement and experience and activity. It's in parts how it led me to this mountain piece, this idea of repetition and cyclical responsibility and healing, or how healing comes into place with that. And I'll discuss this with Cindy. I would love to open this up for her right now, if possible. Cindy.
Well, it's so beautiful just even seeing these few images of your work. And if you know anything about Amanda, she's quite prolific. So there's so much work that she's made. And I think it's really interesting seeing how she transforms all of these materials through this very kind of poetic aesthetic. And I was really interested in talking to her about this particular performance, which is ongoing, which I think it's quite unusual to get to talk to an artist about a project that they're in the midst of. And a lot of times it takes time to kind of process things until you're finished with the work. So I think some of these ideas are going to be things that are kind of happening in real time, and perhaps this piece will change over time, which I think Amanda it's kind of, I don't know that any of her work is ever finished. You know, some of these projects like Memory House have been going on for years, even though they're not going on continuously. They're not seen as like a finished project, which I think is really interesting. And so I've prepared some questions for us to talk about this project. And certainly if you have anything that comes up as you're listening that you want to hear more about, or have a question that's related, you can certainly put it in the chat, and we'll have time at the end
to answer some more questions. But I guess I just wanted to start because many of your works engage performance, but I think in this way that it's very much about ritual. And so I was curious if you could talk about in this new performance, just the different layers of ritual, the journey to the place, the actions that you're taking interacting with the cloth, and also the documentation, like all these different layers that you're having kind of thinking about ritual and how that kind of plays out in other projects that you've made too.
I think that goes back to my upbringing between both my grandmothers. They were both very much around ritual in the household. Spiritual rituals was also very present in our households. I had also the complete opposite spectrum of grandmothers. One was an indigenous Caboclo woman, and the other was an Orthodox Christian woman. They both belong to this idea of the out-of-body experience within space, but in a very different polarizing way. One to the extreme oppression of the body, and the other to the extreme freedom of the body. This has been with me my whole life, and I feel like in performance, the thing that attracted me to this type of work in the first place is the sense of ritual. It was a safe place for me. It was the rite of incubation, like incubating myself in this role where the natural landscape is a part of me, and I'm a part of the natural landscape. It gives me this sense of belonging. It gives me this sense of connection to the space, no matter where I end up. Also, the body and the mind of an expat, of a body of an immigrant, is often always, by definition, in transition. Doesn't quite fit or belong in what, neither there nor here. So this ritual to me is, in a sense, especially this mountain ritual, began when the pandemic started. I felt like I needed to connect with both my grandmothers. I missed home, and I think like everyone else, when the pandemic began, we've all turned to family in some ways.
Your grandmothers are both in Brazil?
They're both in Brazil, and they're both still alive. There was a need to connect with that. There's a need. I couldn't go home. I can't go home right now. Nobody can travel. It's still, who knows what will happen in the next few months. But this cloth began to me as, even in the sewing of it, the stitching, it was a matter of connection with them, as like they taught me how to stitch. They taught me how to sew. They taught me how to embroider, or how to fix my pants, or how to fix, a ripped shirt. In this sense of stitching too, is a very visceral feeling. It's satisfactory. Like I couldn't do anything else but to sew during this time. And I didn't know why, but I feel like after all this time, I realized it's because once you put in a needle, you can't go back. It's like it's a radical decision of just go with it. And you can't really trace your steps again. You have to just keep going forward. Yeah.
And when we spoke before, you talked about the journey that you take. So you've been going to this location. Is it Mount Wilson Trail, the location? Off of Mount Wilson Trail?
It's off of Mount Wilson Trail. And it takes about an hour to hike up there. Because I'm carrying like a toddler on my back. This cloth has become really heavy, and it's grown. Right now it's 60 feet long, and it's just canvas rolled up. And the backpack even changed through time. I started with a little backpack, and then it grew to a mid-sized backpack, and now it's a giant cross-country backpack. So in a sense of it, I'm also, the weight and the time that takes me to get there is part of the ritual. I don't record this time. This is the time for me to dedicate to connecting with these words, the text that I'm writing, this mantra-like space. And the location has primarily stayed in Mount Wilson, but I have been dislocated due to fires and due to lockdowns during the pandemic, because this is a very small trail. In fact, like going there, it's not easy either. You don't see a lot of people going up and down all the time, but because it's so small during the lockdown, you weren't allowed to go up there because people can't cross one another without rubbing the shoulder kind of thing. So I've been sneaking in back there during this time as well. Yeah.
And what about the text that you're writing on that you're stitching? You had mentioned that when we had talked before that you think about that as you're walking.
Yeah, the writing is very intentional. The writing, some of the text is a repetition of what I said before, but in a different way. I'm almost trying to learn how to read again. I'm trying to learn how to say things in the way that I mean it, really paying attention to the words instead of mimicking them or borrowing them or taking them from someone else. To me, it is something, it feels similar to learning a new language. Like when I learned English, you adapt to a sense of sound, and then it's just like a baby, and then you start mimicking, and then you start saying, but you're not quite saying what you mean just yet. It takes time for you actually to grasp the language enough to really say something that comes from yourself, not from the environment you are a part of. So in this case, I say so much depends upon remembering. So the stitches are also an act of remembrance. I want to mark this time, and I want to say something here now, which has a sense of urgency in some ways. Like my grandmother used to tell me, I have to tell you something now. When she says that, I kind of freaked out immediately. I was like, oh, something is wrong.
Like it
what
was
is
some kind of wisdom, or it was something like,
yeah, it could go either way.
Yeah. Wisdom or
exactly
recommendation for improvement.
or let me tell you what you're doing wrong, or else. But yes, it could go either way. And there was always a moment of when she said that, I have to pay attention. It doesn't matter, and there's a difference in Portuguese or in English too, but with the sense of hearing and the sense of listening. Hearing in the world is, we're hearing things all the time. It's noise you're not necessarily welcoming in, it's just there. Listening, it's a part of you that pays so much attention that you are taking it all in, and then you decide what to do with that.
Well, it sounds too like that kind of listening could also be related to something more spiritual, right? Or something of greater significance that you're focusing in on. And I think it's interesting that, you're referencing your grandmothers and talking about this kind of domestic art, and thinking about even like stitching and sewing are often like very private actions that happen inside, in domestic spaces. And I'm wondering about your choice to take this work into public. And it seems like many of your projects, there is this kind of intimate, private gesture that you're enacting, but you're doing it in this, and even if there's not an audience there, it's very different, like being in the desert or being on the mountainside than being inside your house. So I'm curious about that decision of taking it into this public realm.
Yeah, there's this, when I can bring back to also again language in this sense. Like in Portuguese, we have two words for home, lar and casa. Lar in some ways is what we call something that you feel like you belong to. It carries a sentimental value. It carries poetry in the meaning of the word. It doesn't have to be an architecture. It doesn't have to be a wall space. It can be anywhere as long as you sense that lar is there. Casa is a geographic position, is a location, is a residence. When I moved here and I didn't understand how in the world they didn't have a word for lar, I couldn't find that word anywhere in English. I had to find it in concepts and in actions and in spaces that I felt that that belonged there. So I choose often spaces that are not my home, that are not necessarily even exhibition spaces. They are spaces I stumble upon. They are spaces that I just happened to walk by or happened to hear about, did a little research and found so much connection to it. And that's kind of how I start choosing these locations.
And so for this particular work, you keep going back to the same place. It's not a different location. You keep going back to the exact same location.
Yes, as for as long as I've been able to go up there, I'm going back to the bench. There was a fire. I'm sharing this image here, a fire that evacuated us from this area, and I wasn't able to go up there for about a month out of 8 months I've been doing this, or even a little longer than a month and a half. So after that, I went and found other locations to stitch on. It was a little different. It was a little bit harder to sink in and to find grounds, but I found within this location that I could also find space and time to do this.
And you
The
are
pilgrim,
stitching the date on, right? That's what the one image shows, that you
yeah,
always stitch the number of the day, numbers of days.
yeah. At the end of the cloth, each cloth has a beginning, like a calendar period of days. So at the end of each cloth, I write down how many days has passed. Today is day 249, I think, of stitching.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the next question that I had, was really related to this, the duration, that it's been 249 days. And just if you could talk about how the kind of accumulation and duration has impacted the work. I know obviously physically it's become heavier. It now looks like this beautiful textile river when you see it kind of flowing outward. So it's obviously accumulated, but I'm wondering if the content in the work has shifted, or the meaning, or is still shifting. I know this is not like a culmination yet, but I'm just curious about how the duration and the fact too that you're doing it on a daily basis. So it really is a daily practice. And so how that is impacting the work as you're in the process.
It's a daily practice. It is like, a daily practice of, let's say, a prayer, of sitting there and intentionally surrendering to these questions in my mind, and I have to answer them. In some ways, I think it has changed. The cloth has changed. The type of text I write has changed. It has gone from finding connection to being angry, to being really sad, to finding other ways to joy, and particularly to poetry in my life, in order to push forward. And the text has evolved. Even in the writing itself has gone from different types of typo and embroidery techniques. So it has changed in its physicality too, in the imagery. In some ways, the text takes a lot of time. So each letter is about, let's say, 1 to 5 minutes, depending on the letter. And then a word takes a few minutes, and a sentence could take an hour to even write. And I change.
The length of the text vary from day to day. Like some days it is just a sentence, and other days it may be a longer passage.
Yeah, some days it's just a sentence. Some days it's just a word. I don't really have anything else. Yeah. It's the practice in this sense is this. Some people call it a meditation. I call it an oniric practice. It's almost like dreaming awake. This idea of a dream state while you're awake. It's a sense of regeneration within the body and the space and the time that we're living in, integrating myself fully in this context of sewing, which is it's a craft, and it's such a domestic practice, but I'm also using it to say something that I believe that won't disappear. It's something that I can count on, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think too, it's sort of like that idea of the ritual in any form that it takes can open up that kind of meditation space, or this kind of, and I think I certainly identify with that in my own family. Like, women were always knitting, sewing, crocheting, and there was this way that it was almost like a way for them to relax, even though they were producing and laboring. It was a different kind of labor, and it was also meant kind of like in this very pure way, was something they chose to do, so that it was a more autonomous kind of action. And I guess the what I wanted to ask you about too is about, the title, which you've already mentioned, I've got to tell you something now. Like, there is this urgency in that, but that we as the viewer don't get to see what you're what you're stitching. It's very private. And so I'm curious about that, the urgency of the telling, or is it just more like you need to record it? It's not really like I need to physically verbalize it to you, but I need to record it in some way. I'm just curious about that dichotomy between the urgency of language and the privacy of language.
I think it comes to the spirituality of it. I think I briefly mentioned earlier, but it's this idea of how much do you share with an intention of, and how much is understood when you share is another thing, is another layer. So the moment I keep it private, it really is just up to me to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not really a lot of pressure with the surrounding and the outside realm.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment I give voice to something in a public space, I feel like I have to listen to it more as well, because it's something that I have, if I'm taking up this much space in the outside, as people walk by and they might see me, I share this responsibility with them as well.
And how do people respond to you when you're doing this performance? Do you see the same people over and over again, or is it just?
There are a couple of regular hikers that I walk by, and now they recognize me. I recognize them. One is a bird watcher. We end up talking, and she told me there's over 200 species of birds behind this house.
Wow, amazing.
And so you learn, there's a regularity there too, but for the most part, I go at different times in the day when I can. And the spot I'm in is actually not quite visible from the regular path. It's a little bit off the path intentionally, so I don't bother anyone, and the cloth doesn't go over any passage in any way. But people that know the bench is there, if they walk in, they will ask questions. Some have asked to take a picture, some have asked to. This older man in the very beginning asked if I was praying, which was interesting.
But you are in a way, in your
I guess I was
own, own, and not necessarily in a traditional Christian way, but
yeah, absolutely. It is a prayer in a sense of a spiritual connection to the words and the space and the time I'm there. And it's listening. It's part of the listening thing. It's like I think when we're trying to listen, we're paying close attention to that part of us that is unknown, that is not necessarily the cognitive self, but it's the visceral self that can be invisible at times.
Yeah, and I think that obviously the just kind of the generation of the text or the writing is important, and I know in a lot of your other work there's this use of language, and also a lot of research and interest in female artists and women's narratives. And I'm just wondering if you thought about how important it is that this narrative is coming from a female body, or how that might impact. I mean, obviously the use of this stitching, which I think of as a very, traditionally female domestic action, but I'm just wondering even about the kinds of narratives that you're making. Is there a relationship between your gender or your interest in feminist art and the kinds of narratives that you are generating?
I think it's inevitable to really speak to that in some ways. This does come from my upbringing with the matriarchs in the family, leading up to my experience as an artist in a female body, and continuing with my education, which I had no really traditional education in the sense of the word. I educated myself with free libraries. And in accessing free libraries, I looked at works by women that I could find myself in. It was more like a self-guided path. And I do believe that's very much a part of how I function in the world. I also think the language that the role plays in this and the female narrative is very much intertwined. There hasn't been in the history of our humanity enough texts that tells the narrative of women immigrants in particular, that I would like to hear more of, read more of, watch more of, listen more of. All these narratives, I know they're there and they existed. It's just not accessible necessarily. And that is always in my mind. Like, how do you leave these narratives behind for the following generation to recognize themselves in?
Well, it's
And
interesting. It's like I mean, that is the part of the documentation that and I think it's interesting too. It's like, in some ways, this is a book, even though it's in this non-traditional form. It really is this text. Although I think it's interesting too, just thinking about the form of it, like the way we might take in a traditional book, it's very intimate and we're close to it and we can kind of flip through it. You would physically have to change your body movements to take in this text, and you'd have to kind of travel through space. So I think that's interesting to think about. Like, it's not, I don't know if you will ever show this as an object or as something that somebody could read the entire thing. And you show bits and pieces of it whenever you're posting, because you're posting this every day, right, on social media. So there's that other aspect that in some ways that's also like another public ritual where you're performing it and then you're documenting it. And in some ways, like, social media seems very like a very different kind of media than this thing that's in nature and very personal. And I like that you're very fluid. I know that you've done this with your other pieces too, that you don't see the digital as, like as something that won't fit with your aesthetic. Like you turn your Instagram into this beautiful poetic document, just like you do with everything else that you make. So I think that's interesting. But I wonder about what you think, or if you've even thought about, like, if the textile would ever be separated as an object, because right now it's part of this process, right? Part of this performance.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I'll share the cloth. I mean, I haven't thought of it that far yet, because it's still in the making and it's still not finished. And once I finish, yeah, possibly I could I don't know how it would be read. It's so long. I don't know how I would share it. I think people would have to unroll it and walk on top of it like a carpet, walking through a carpet. I haven't even gone back to reread it. I don't even know if it makes sense necessarily. I think it will read maybe like a poem, broken parts, like with some nuance, but also leaving room for interpretation.
Well, it's almost like a diary, right? Like, you're not editing this at all. It's like the pure, like, from your body onto the cloth. So it is almost like a document of that day in some ways too, that it's not being edited or changed.
No, there are even misspellings. Like, I showed it to a neighbor the other day and she pointed out a misspelling, and I guess I can't go back and unstitch that.
No,
but yeah,
you could get some white thread, and you don't want to do that. You want the purity, I think, of the action. And I think it's interesting too, and you just talked about, if someone were to read it, they would have to walk upon it. And I think normally when we think about art objects, they're on a pedestal, they're behind glass, we can't touch them or breathe on them. And in your piece, you're actually dragging your art object through the dirt. And, so I think it's interesting that it's not this precious object, that it feels very, and I think it's interesting, it's not precious in a like monetary way, but it is very personal and precious to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if I could make this if I turned it into a precious object. It has to be a kind of mad, like, dragging through everything I'm going through, and also the quality of gathering and taking the stains and taking the dirt and carrying it leaves, and we found spiders rolling in there. Like, it's the combination of being outside, inside, that I very much relate to in this piece, and it brings what it brings with it from
it's very
outside.
organic, right? I mean, and even it's a textile, it has like this dye on it, and it almost is like, in some ways, like a skin or a memorial in some way. It seems like that it kind of keeps growing. I don't know, I hadn't thought about that before. It's kind of cool to think about the textile itself as a body, and that the body was very small, and now you're carrying this very large body. And who knows, I mean, at some point it might be bigger than you are. I don't know how you will carry it at that point. And maybe it's interesting to think about, like, if you just kept doing this for the rest of your life, how big this textile would become. But probably you won't need to, right? Because it started in this very specific way. It started at the beginning of this pandemic. And I wonder, we had talked about this privately, but I wonder if you want to say anything about like how this piece will end, or if it will end, or how you even come to a conclusion with a work like this.
I believe it'll end. It'll end. It has to. Uh, I mean, the timeline that I'm giving myself has been so coincidental with these historical landmarks that are happening this year, 2020. I think since the pandemic began, a lot of other things have happened in the social and political and scheme of things, realms of things. Personal lives are changing, language is changing all the time. I like that this piece in some ways is giving me a timeline, or almost like a sense of time, because I'm losing otherwise the idea of what time means. And I know I hear this from a lot of people all the time, like today's already almost, we're like on Thanksgiving week. Like, what is this? This year went by so fast. But it's the idea of subjective time versus our personal time has changed.
Yeah, for everyone. It's very true.
For everyone.
Yeah.
And I'm using this space in some ways to kind of give myself this relationship with time that has been structured. And I have to go up there and sit and stitch and then walk back. That time is, I'm stuck there. I can't get out. It's, once I'm in, I'm in.
Well, it'll probably be really strange too once you do stop the piece. That,
Yeah.
like that this daily ritual will no longer be there, but maybe you'll start another daily ritual. Maybe
Yeah.
there will be some other ritual that takes its place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just the possibility of having this ritual being so like the idea of transformation through one ritual, right? Like the growth of the cloth, the shift of the text, the colors have changed. The density and the weight has changed. I'm interpreting this processing transformation in some ways. I'm processing, relying on this time to be able to understand something, a question I might have. And sometimes I come up with a question beforehand, and then I go on the walk, and then I think about how to answer it. And that has changed within me too, and how I behave in the world. This piece is kind of in some ways guiding me back in how I behave in the world.
Interesting. Yeah, it is. It's like this very kind of solitary practice. And you had mentioned earlier too about this idea of healing. And so are you thinking about that as like a self-healing, or are you thinking about that in this more kind of cosmic, like this gesture that would emanate out in some way?
Yeah, I think in some ways we are carrying on so much trauma right now, borrowed trauma from the news, trauma from our neighbors, our own traumas, the heavy content on social media that's just bombarding us with more trauma. Everything seems to it's either toxic or it doesn't grab your attention. It seems that way, right? Like as we're living through this time. And I wanted this to be in some ways shared as a moment that isn't doing that, that's doing quite the opposite, that's having you kind of just sit there and like watch a woman stitch. I don't know. It's maybe not very fun, but it may not give you a lot of excitement, but it's a way to reflect upon that within yourself. But
Although
I'm hoping.
I do think rituals are often very magnetic because we don't actually experience them. And I think you're probably right that at this point in time, there is a real absence of that. Like everything is so heightened, everything is so dramatic, or I don't know. I mean, I think there, like, there's something very beautiful and magnetic about a person engaged, I think both for the performer and also for people who might encounter the piece. And then I think even just encountering the documentation of it, like there is this quality of the body and the landscape that just even seeing pictures of your performances, like I feel renewed in some way, or I feel hopeful. You know, there's something hopeful about seeing this beautiful text unfolding over the mountainside.
Thank you. That's the biggest compliment you can pay to me
I'm
right now.
sure lots of other people are having that experience. I mean, and I think that's the great thing too about you using social media, which is sometimes taboo, or I probably not anymore, but I don't know that we always consider it like this place that that's where we're gonna show our work or exhibit our work. And I think you do it
Yeah.
so effectively. And it also means that so many more people can experience the work than if it was in like a more traditional art space, or even people who aren't able to access the work, see it live. And I think you do a fantastic job of documenting the work too, you know, that you have really beautiful documentation of the projects that you make.
Well, social media is that, like, to me, it's like another tool of access. It doesn't have to be the, you know, the devil in disguise. A lot of people treat it in that sense. Like in a sense, also social media made a lot of what I've done so far possible, because I've chosen just about every location has been so remote. It's not like I rely on an audience to be there.
Right.
How I've done what I've done so far is really part of the social media is I've used as also even as a guide for me to archive work. I use it as archival in some ways. Like I can track back memory house over the past 4 years through my Instagram account. I can remind myself by using the right hashtags and the date.
So it's
that
like
I can
archive.
It's
too.
an archive in a cloud. It's not a website, but I like it that it functions as just an image archive, nothing else.
I ask about social media too. The other day, I think it was over the weekend, you posted an image of you in an alternate space. You're not on the mountain, but there's some deer next to you.
Mhm.
Was that scenario? That was like a magical image. You're like, yeah.
That's because
Yeah,
Amanda is magical. She's like Snow White, like all of the birds and the deer.
That's what it made me think of. Yeah.
I'm visited by deer. Well, I live really close to the forest, so deers are around kind of all the time, but they come around when I'm outside sometimes, and they just sit there or take a nap. They have become like comfortable around, which is I like that.
Well, it's probably too that you're so quiet, right? That you're doing
Yeah.
this very quiet, meditative thing, and so you're not a threat, or you're not putting out that kind of energy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also learned that deers can sense. They are really good with smells. So if they crossed you before, they will recognize your smell from afar.
Interesting. Interesting.
Beautiful. Well, do we want to open it up for?
Yeah.
We're getting. I know we're nearing the end here, so
No, that would be great. I'm sure
folks an
people have-
opportunity to ask some questions if they would like to. So you can either put them in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And I'm trying to see everybody in case I see a hand go up. Leah, are you interested in?
Yes, I wanted to ask. It feels to me as if this. I was thinking about Vermeer making a painting called The Lace Maker, and the documentation over a long period of time of a woman doing stitching work, and how the Vermeer painting is lots of layers on top of each other, durational, but the layers are invisible, and about how Amanda's documentation is like beads on a string. It's the duration is marked by one image, one image, one image, one image, one image, and that sequential. That the way that the garment unrolls is sequential in changing color and changing words and things like that, and also that the documentation is sequential. Anyway, it was just a thought about how work is layered, how work is hidden and how work is revealed. And I just wondered, it feels to me, Amanda, as if your documentation is the art piece in itself in a lot of ways. What do you think about that?
I mean, thank you, Lee. I love that idea of documentation is becoming my practice in some ways. Like, I do think because of the choices I've made to perform in isolating areas and what is there to leave behind, what is there to see, what comes with me to the studio, what comes back around. These layers is very much present in my work. Like the example of Memory House. In Memory House, I've carried the same window around with me.
Yeah.
That belonged in every single space that I've been. This window has been there. This same chair has been there. There's this idea of reusing and a continuation of material that becomes such a part of the project that then it lives as an artifact of this piece eventually. So I guess in some ways I look at this cloth as the artifact, but then the photographs of the process are also artifacts.
Okay, but give it a kind of form.
To give it a kind of also to give it a memory, really, to give it a sense of looking back and recognizing what happened so you can move forward. Because memories are, to me, there are two types of memories. There's elusive memory and then there's a elusive memory. There's the memory that I feel like is an indirect reference of what happened. And there's a type of memory that's just difficult to remember. And I think in some ways, society has found itself in a place and time right now that I feel like we are forgetting to remember a lot of things. We're intentionally forgetting things. And I wanted this for me to be a physical and an analogy of how this is affecting us in the sense of how to record memory.
Like they're like benchmarks almost.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
There's a few more in the chat. Who are the poets and writers who enliven the way you approach and use language?
Oh, there's so many. I don't even know where to begin. Recently, I can say just right now, I'm really into the work of Anais Nin because she used to live in this house that I'm in, and that's another story. I'm working with her presence in this home that I live in, and I learned English with her. Also, I taught myself with her diaries in the beginning of moving here. Hilda Hilst is a Brazilian writer I've been reading a lot of right now because I'm working on translating her to English. And various writers and even some philosophers that I've come to adore, and then honestly too musicians. Like I reference a lot of text through music. Also, like a lot of my meditation practice comes through sound, and the musicians I'm listening to, I want to hear what they're saying. Like Laurie Anderson being one of them is a huge inspiration. She's a spoken word artist and a musician and an artist. But those are some of the many people. Whoever asked that question can like send me a message and I'll send you a list. I'm also part of a feminist book club, which I learned so much from, which Cindy is a part of as well. We read primarily women in translation, and such as Clarice Lispector, who is a huge influence in my work as well. But yeah. I don't know if
we have another question in the chat from Andre. He asked, how does performance, it just went off the screen for me, just one second. How does performance art inform your poetry or writing versus writing it alone at home? I mean, how is it different in both places?
It's different. Yeah, I like that question. I never thought of it that way, but I think writing poetry at home feels more of trial and error kind of thing. You know, it's through practice and giving yourself the time to sit down and write something down. I also learned English through like the idea of poems too, because it's so fragmented that it was easier to actually learn a language through that. And it's how I actually think about things in some ways. The linear narrative is in poetry. When I'm performing, it's not so much like a poem. I would say it's more like a mantra of what I'm trying to say. And eventually it might become a poem because it's so many of these lines in repetition, but it works more as a practice of a mantra of saying the same thing over and over and over in order to sink in.
Great. Thank you. I wish we could continue to be flies on the wall and listen to you two in conversation. It's really fascinating. So I want to thank Cindy and Amanda both for your generosity and time today. Really wonderful.
Thank you.
So could I ask both of you to put your either Instagram or website in the chat for everyone who'd like additional information?
Yeah, I also put the SISU reading group in the chat if anyone's interested. We just meet once a month. I know there are lots of people here who are from the group, so that's really cool to see everybody. But if you're interested in joining a feminist reading group, we'd love to have you.
Excellent. Thanks, Cindy.
Yeah.
We also ask that you complete a very, very short and quick survey that will just help us in future programming. Thank you again so much for your time, energy, creativity, and for helping us, get a peek into your ongoing process, Amanda. That's really wonderful. And thanks, Cindy, for facilitating. Wonderful as always. So
Yeah.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, take good care, be safe, wear your mask, and have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you for having me. Ciao.